Story 1. I am bilingual, and it was my first week in kindergarten. I met this girl, and we started talking in fluent Spanish. This went on for about a week. We weren't really friends, but we were cool around each other. After the weekend, I came back and tried to talk to her in Spanish. She said that she forgot she ever spoke it over the weekend and never crossed words with me again. I don't know what happened, but she never spoke Spanish again. Story 2. In the early 90s, I had just purchased my first car earlier in the day, and I drove about an hour to the Pennsylvania coal region to pick up my girlfriend from her job at a deli. I was chatting with the deli owners while my girlfriend was finishing up, and an older gentleman walked into the store. The owner said to him, "Hey, have you ever met my girlfriend's boyfriend?" I reached out to shake his hand and introduce myself, and he grabbed my hand tightly and didn't let go while saying, "You're currently shaking the hand of a man who shook the hand of Herbert Hoover in 1934. Then he let go of my hand and walked back out the door without buying anything. Story 3. When I was in the psychiatric ward, there was a man who fully believed that everything was somehow a conspiracy that involved Mickey Mouse. He talked about Mickey Mouse and space a lot. He also said things like, "Well, this is some Mickey Mouse nonsense. Really big Disney fan, or maybe hater, I suppose." Story 4. My college roommate did a lot of weird things, but the weirdest was her obsession with people copying her. She would randomly accuse people of stealing her outfits or things she liked. She screamed at our neighbor for wearing pink headphones because she had pink headphones. She would cry because someone else had the same very ordinary popular hairstyle. She wrote me a 3-page letter about me listening to Tupac because she liked Tupac, and why was I trying to be her? It went on and on. She eventually had to leave because she punched a girl we knew for buying and wearing the same very popular jacket as she had. She just radiated hostility in everything she did, never met anyone like it, and I've met some bad people. She's a prosecutor now. Story 5. I knew a girl in 3rd grade who didn't have any friends, so I decided to become her friend. It was one of those situations where you soon begin to realize why the person had no friends. She wasn't really a bad person, but she didn't behave like any normal kid I knew at the time. Here's the big thing. She believed she was a dragon. And yeah, I know kids play make-believe a lot, and that's fine, but she was fully convinced that she and all her family were 6,000-year-old dragons. She would often walk around making dragon noises, hissing, scratching people, mostly me, and even biting. She would talk about her wings and her tail and act like she was messing with them. I didn't want to tell her she wasn't a dragon, so I just kind of went along with it. If she wasn't talking about being a dragon, she was usually just talking about her pet goat. That's all I remember of her. Really, her biting me and talking about her family goat. After 3rd grade, I never saw her again, so I'd assume she probably moved schools. Story 6. Are we talking good weird or bad weird? Good. A Finnish supervisor I had when I worked for the city had the driest, most sarcastic personality. You never knew if he was serious or not. The most unique person I ever met. You either hated him or loved him. I loved him. I don't think I've ever laughed so hard at the weirdest things he would say. Bad. I had a boss when I worked in the automotive industry. He always seemed like a good enough guy, but whenever he would hang around and try to chat, he might tell a joke or a story. When you told one back, it was like he wasn't even there. He didn't react, he didn't engage, and sometimes he'd walk away even if you were still talking. He could hear and answer questions. But he always seemed like he was interested in you, yet couldn't give the slightest indication that you mattered. Such a psychopath. Story 7. That one guy who hunts goblins with his friends, does a yearly seance to contact Santa, communes with space vampires, leads spoon-bending parties, and eats haunted ramen noodles. Easily the weirdest guy I've ever met. Love him though. Story 8. I briefly worked as a clerk at a newspaper, and now I work in a library, so I've met a broad spectrum of humanity. Probably my favorite person is the dude who would come into the newspaper office once a month and hand me a handwritten letter to the editor. Our interactions were brief but pleasant and totally normal, except for the fact that he dressed like he lived in the 18th century. I'm pretty sure he wrote his letters to the editor with a quill pen. The kicker is that we never once published his letters because newspapers are perennially short-staffed, and we did not have time to type up handwritten content. But he kept coming, and he never expressed disappointment that we didn't print his letters. Story 9. Worked at a thrift store, met all kinds of weird individuals. Number 1 was a guy who came in every day and suddenly disappeared for a month or so. When he came back, I asked where he had been. He told me he had been hospitalized because he let his dog lick an open wound on his leg after the dog had eaten some roadkill. His leg got infected, and he was unable to clean it because his bathtub was full of bouncy balls. Never asked him a personal question again. Story 10. A kid who was hired as a graduate in my office job. As a new starter, he would take lunchtime naps in an unused meeting room. When that meeting room started being used, he started napping under his desk. This was in an open-plan office. Sometimes for lunch, he would bring to work a single whole tomato. He would put it on a plate and eat it with a knife and fork. He would close his eyes and say grace first. Sometimes he would snack on a big block of tasty cheese, just holding the whole block and biting off chunks. Once, someone else in the office bought a pack of gourmet sausages at lunchtime and put them in the office fridge to keep fresh. This kid took them home and ate them, then emailed the whole office saying he had accidentally taken the sausages home and eaten them, and had bought a new pack to replace them. The replacement pack was the cheapest sausages available. I was a senior person in the office and once delegated some work to him. His response was, "Why don't you do it?" When the global financial crisis happened, this kid was the first person to be sacked. He tried to get an unfair dismissal payout. Story 11. A guy named Anthony picked me up in a Mazda coupe with no muffler when I was hitchhiking near San Francisco. He was a short, fat Italian guy who drove with the pedal to the floor, talked extremely fast, and used the word hella in every single sentence. He immediately pretended like we had been friends for years. We stopped at an arcade that he claimed to own to drop off cases of glass-bottled Coke. Right when we walked in, the actual owner yelled, "I told you if you ever came back here, I'd shoot you." So we dropped the soda and ran out. Then, he went full speed over the Golden Gate Bridge while blaring some techno remix of a Madonna song. It was the funniest 20 minutes of my life. Great guy. Story 12. An old classmate who I met after 20 years. We talked for 1 hour and exchanged numbers. The next day he called me and yelled at me. He accused me of calling his sister in the night to frighten her. I was like, "Dude, I don't even have her number. How and why should I call her?" I convinced him that it wasn't me and told him to delete my number. Story 13. When I lived in Warsaw, Poland, I went to the international school there. It's common to have a good number of students move to and from the area every year. I was one of 5 Americans at the school, and we heard a new American girl was coming. So we were asked to meet her and show her around the school before the school year started. She was in a super religious family, and her parents wouldn't even let her watch SpongeBob because the city was called Bikini Bottom, and they felt that was inappropriate. She was also from Nebraska, and she would say the oddest things that made the rest of us so uncomfortable, not to forget that every response to our questions would make the situation awkward. Story 14. When I worked as a personal trainer, I had a very odd client. He would have been about 65 and extremely skinny and sickly looking. I think he basically used the personal training sessions as his human interaction and therapy. He wore thick, mismatched foundation on his cheeks and forehead only, and had very wispy, dyed black hair. He was a close talker who would get right up in my face to talk. He insisted on having his skin folds measured every week, even though fat loss was not a problem for him whatsoever. He told me that all he ate for every meal was a large can of tuna and frozen broccoli. He was really possessive of my time, and after a while, I felt I needed to distance myself from him as he became very attached to me. He once had a crying meltdown in the gym when a class schedule changed and I wasn't taking the class for the day. He would regularly call the gym and ask for me. It was so unsettling dealing with him. He was fine at some points and then completely unhinged at other times. Story 15. I'm an information technology professional at work. I don't know if he has ever encountered humans before. It's like every day is his first on this planet. Last week, he stood in my office doorway, burped loudly, then walked away. His mating call, maybe? Also, he is not good at information technology. Story 16. I used to live around the corner from a guy called Tom who I grew up with. I went to school with him and all that other good stuff. He was the weirdest kid I've ever met. He would beat on his chest like a gorilla, make his spit touch the ground and suck it back up, and scream at his mom over trivial things. He had a book or diary with people from the area's names in it, with star ratings next to them. A very strange guy, to say the least. Story 17. I knew of this kid in high school who had a chronic masturbation problem. This kid was out of control. He would masturbate so much that his parents used to tape boxing gloves on his hands at night. That kid was me. Story 18. Hard to call it weird because it was legitimate mental health, but I worked in a residential program for adults with mental health diagnoses. One young man legitimately believed he was on a reality TV show and was competing to find a girlfriend. He also believed he used to host another television show. The worst it got was when he and another young resident were legitimately trying to date a part-time staff, who thankfully wanted none of it. He also believed that the band Green Day wrote songs about him, for example, When September Ends. Here's the weird thing though, a few years later he tragically died in an ATV accident, and the month he died in was September. Story 19. I met this lady one day at work. She saw me from inside the valet booth I was working in. She called me out to speak with her, and she said that I was the most beautiful man she has ever encountered, and she started crying. I didn't know what to do, so I stood awkwardly trying to calm her down. Then she said, "You can do better than this. The gods gave you this face for a reason. Use it, please use it," and sincerely walked away. It was so very weird. I don't know if maybe I could have looked like someone she loved or who knows, but it did make me question why she got so emotional. Story 20. When I was 17, I met this 14-year-old kid who had been in and out of juvenile detention. He was super weird. The way he acted was strange. He would call me around 30 times a day for about a month straight. He had his own daughter who was a couple of years old. There was one day I counted, and he called me a total of 72 times straight in one singular day, and I answered about 36 of them, only for him to simply say one word or nothing. Fast forward a couple of years, and he tried to stab one of my friends with another one of my friend's knives. He's locked up now. Story 21. I knew this one guy in my dorm who just kind of had this weird feeling about him from the get-go. He would brag about how he had this hypersexual French girlfriend, how they would masturbate on the phone at night. He would fly home every other weekend to hang out and have sexual relations. So yes, complete nonsense. Like a good 80% of the conversations with him could be summed up as sex in school. Well, one night he got drunk and he let his secret slip. Not that he didn't have a girlfriend, by the way. In fact, she never came up. No, he let slip that he had fantasies about assault. He wanted to pull a girl off the street and force himself on her. Let's just say after that, I paid a bit more attention to those campus assault reports. Never saw his name pop up, and I hope he never lived out those fantasies. Story 22. Met a guy at a wake once who was like a real-life supervillain. I can't describe it, but he had the exact same manic energy of Heath Ledger's Joker, mixed with Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. He looked like a blend of both too, with Heath's Joker hair and Willem's face. He was wearing a vintage pinstripe brown and tan suit, and black and white wingtip shoes. It legitimately looked like a costume. The brief interaction I had with him was jarring. The best I can describe it was like talking to a theater kid back in high school, but he was like 52. This was 15 years ago, and I vividly remember him. Story 23. Brian James Hathaway, nicknamed Bambi, was serving 18 months on a parole violation at Jackson Correctional in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. He was there for an assault on an off-duty policewoman. The nickname came from a previous charge where he was caught engaging in inappropriate behavior with a deceased deer on the side of the road. Story 24. Alice was from the grocery store where I worked when I was 18. It was in a very touristy area near a national park, so all homes were mobile homes and everyone was a roommate to their coworkers. She was 50 years older than me and played canasta on her desktop while chain smoking. She also watched Spanish soap operas on her days off, though she did not understand the language. One evening, she was the last to close the store and had $10,000 in an envelope to be deposited into the company account at the bank. Instead, She took off to Mexico with the $10,000 and was never heard from again. Miss you, Alice. Story 25. The child who sat beside me in 5th grade always wore the same clothes 2 days in a row. Once, while in line, I noticed he was eating something, so I asked him what it was. He responded, specialized food for hamsters, gerbils, and guinea pigs, without any further explanation. Okay then. Story 26. A boy from my school would do the weirdest and grotesque stuff like talking to himself and engaging in odd behavior with the grass. However, I also felt bad for him because many of the kids would pick on him.